Welcome to the Six Conditions podcast, where we explore the science and art of great teams. Join show hosts Drs. Ruth Wageman and Krister Lowe for pithy summaries of great research being done on teams and organizations, as well as inspired and artful approaches for using those ideas to enable brilliant collaborations. Let's get today's conversation started.
Welcome, everyone, to the Six Conditions podcast, where we're exploring the science and art of great teams. My name is Krister Lowe, and I'm joined with Ruth Wageman, and we're super excited in this launch episode to bring a new podcast to you around great teams. Hey, Ruth, how's it going?
It's going great, Krister. Glad to be starting this with you.
Yeah, so super excited to be joining in this conversation with you, Ruth, and with the listeners of this new podcast. And so what we wanted to do here, everyone, in this launch episode is to talk a little bit about the purpose of the show, introduce ourselves as the show hosts, and talk a little bit about what you can expect on this podcast, and really, lay down why we're doing this and why it's important at this time, to bring content like this out into the world for practitioners and academics and the different kinds of audiences that would be interested in a podcast on teams. So Ruth, why don't we start off with a little bit of a review about why we're doing the show, what's the purpose of the show, and really put the show as the center and the hero of this. So why don't we get into that a little bit?
I think some of the reasons behind that are present in our tagline, which is the science and the art of great teams. There's a lot of really wonderful scholarly research that is being done all the time around the eminently practical and really important question of how do you have great collaborations, and what are we learning about what it takes for people to work together and accomplish really amazing things together. So there's an amazing amount of science being done about this, and much of it is really written from and for the perspective of academic scholars. And at the same time, as you know from your work in the team coaching zone, there's a world of practice out there. There are many people who are working to support and lead and design teams in organizations, who are forming collaborations to solve wicked problems, and who have really developed some brilliant intuitive practice about how to do that well. And my aspiration for this podcast is to bring both of those sides together, to share the practical science with practitioners who don't actually get to spend a lot of their time exploring the research literature, and also to bring the art of working with teams to the academics and scholars who are exploring these phenomena in their work.
Yeah. What I would just add to all of that is, I think we're also at a time where organizations are really truly pivoting to much more team-centric approaches to the design and the operation of business. So I think while teams has been a popular topic for the last 20 or 30 years, I think it's really taking on a whole nother level of texture at this time. So I think having more content like this out there for team leaders and team coaches, even people in organizational design, I think is worthy of doing a podcast like this. But Ruth, let's talk a little bit about ourselves with the listeners, and let the listeners get to know us a little bit, which they will be in the coming episodes. But I think you're at home at your home office in New Hampshire. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We have it's winter, and the weather report says there are 2 feet of snow on the way, and I'm looking out at what is already a beautiful tree-covered and snow-covered landscape, and settling in, hopefully, to stay warm in the cold.
Yeah.
And you, Krister?
Yeah, I can match you on that. I'm in New Jersey and outside of Philadelphia, and I woke up to a blanket of snow this morning. Not 2 feet, though, just a couple of inches, but it's a little bit of a winter wonderland there. But yeah, so hopefully, 2 colds will eventually create some heat here in this podcast. But the upshot is there's a lot of light, and it's very bright, and that's all good. But Ruth, I know you have a rich background in the team space. You're not just as an academic and a teacher, but also as a practitioner. But a lot of this goes back to work you did at Harvard with Richard Hackman and some of your colleagues there. But why don't you provide a bit more of an introduction to you and your background, and what brought you to the work of teams, and how that all leads up to where we are today. And I know that could be a full-blown episode in and of itself, so maybe we'll just give the elevator version of that.
Yeah, I do have a few good pithy stories that are great illustrations from way back in my history. But actually, I got started as a social scientist, as a social psychologist, as an undergraduate, studying intrinsic motivation. It was really a revelation to me in my work as an undergraduate at Columbia to realize that you could actually use scientific methods to study human behavior. And we were doing laboratory studies of the impact of different kinds of rewards and feedback on people's joy in what they're doing and how much they intrinsically are motivated to pursue a task. And it really was in recognizing that the findings that we were discovering in the laboratory could potentially make such a powerful difference to how people experienced school and how they experienced work and how they experienced their engagement with each other in organizations, that really led me to pursue a degree in organizational behavior, where I was really very lucky to, on my first day of graduate school, meet Richard Hackman. And yes, that led to a very long and fruitful collaboration. And as listeners of the podcast will discover, Richard's work and his legacy and the brilliant research that he's done over the years about the design of work in organizations, and above all, the design of teams, is really going to pervade the conversations that we're having here. I should also say that Richard, many years ago now, formed a group of scholars at Harvard that was cross-disciplinary and cross schools, called the Groups Group. This is a group of people who study teams. We still convene regularly, and we still regularly speak of Richard's memory. And that's that's part of the community of academic scholars who care deeply about collaboration that we'll be drawing on in the course of this podcast, and many other teams researchers beyond the Groups Group that talk about that kind of work. I've been studying teams for about 30 years now, where the central question is really, what are the most important influences on teams? When people used to say, why are you so interested in teams? I used to say, it's because I hate so much working in them, which has a little bit of truth to it, since I'm pretty introverted. But I've also had some fantastic experiences working in teams. And one that I would name right now is the author team of the Senior Leadership Teams book, which would be Richard Hackman and me and Deborah Nunes and Jim Burris and our colleague Mary Fontaine. That was a really great and joy-filled collaboration in which practitioners and scholars came together to ask the question, what are the unique challenges of leadership teams, and how do we bring both the scholarly perspective and the rich art of working with chief executives and their leadership teams together to really produce practical, usable knowledge about how to have a great leadership team. And I'll just tell one story about that team. It's an issue that's going to come up again. We had this really interesting mid-course inflection where we had been, the total collaboration lasted about 2 years in all. And at about the 1 year midpoint, we had this realization as a team that we were learning tremendously. We were excited every time the team convened. We had so many fantastic insights and observations and stories to tell about the unique challenges of, for example, really articulating a clear and compelling purpose for a leadership team. And a year into our collaboration, we had written not one word. And so we had to call the question and say, is this team ever actually going to produce something usable and actually write a book? And it was a great mid-course correction for us. And as we'll talk about when we talk about timing and transitions in teams, those moments of opportunity can be really critical. And, shout out to Connie Gersick and her research on mid-course corrections in teams. We did settle down and produce a book after that, but it took that real moment of realization about, we're having a great time, but maybe not producing so much.
That's awesome.
How about you, Krister? What do you bring to this this podcast, and what stands out for you as the motivation for why you want to bring this work?
Well, I about 5 years ago really pivoted and decided to niche down in one area. And so I picked team coaching as my topic. I'm an organizational psychologist by training. I've been in learning and development for about 20 years. And I was really a generalist, and I was doing all kinds of things from soft skills training to coaching to retreat facilitation, all kinds of evaluation of programs, e-learning design, all this kind of stuff. But I started to feel a little bit like that the work we were bringing as learning and development practitioners, at least myself, was largely targeted at the individual. But I was just seeing this increasing shift towards work being done in teams. And there was a real disconnect that I had a big run in performance management, and we're doing a lot to train managers and team, individuals to be better at managing their performance, setting goals and learning goals and all these kinds of things, performance goals and learning goals. But again, there's this disconnect that a lot of the work was happening in teams, but the performance management systems weren't organized at the team level. I'd also been doing a lot of work for a good 10 years or so in the conflict resolution area. And my doctoral dissertation was on conflict climates and organizations. And a lot of my just work and my research was really getting at that the underlying design and structure of the organizations was creating a lot of the conflict, a lot of the inefficiency, and oftentimes lack of really good leadership, good team design and setup of teams. So that sort of spurred me on a search for really diving deeper into the area of teams. I had been trained as a coach, an executive coach, and I was seeing the value that spreading learning out one-on-one was doing for the executives I was working with, but I wasn't really satisfied. And I was like, there has to be an analog to that for teams, that the days of just doing an away day, a half day or 1 day or 2 days, even once a year, isn't enough to really set teams up for great success. And while valuable as those events are, they're really events. So I was really diving in. I wanted to dive in and really look more about how do we actually coach teams and support them over time as a growth process. And that led me back to my bookshelf and to Richard Hackman's book behind me, Leading Teams. And then I discovered your work. I did a Google search on team coaching and found your 2005 article with Richard on a theory of team coaching. And that was about 4 years ago. I actually started a podcast called The Team Coaching Zone, and that led me to interviewing 100 thought leaders in the space of team coaching, thinkers, practitioners. And, I think somewhere along that journey, Ruth, I interviewed you, and that was a fateful moment, which led to a nice organic collaboration between you and I over the last couple of years. And we decided about 1.5 to 2 years ago to team up and really bring the 6 conditions framework, the team diagnostic survey out. And, we have a whole global community of practice around that I'm really proud of, and that's really growing. And, it's been a really rich source of learning. So for me, I'm coming to this, it's a passion. I just see the value of it. I'm finding that the work I'm doing, I'm believing in it. I'm seeing the results more. I think there's a lot more to grow and learn. And that's what I'm really excited about, getting on this podcast for, is to really extend the learning and just keep going deeper. Right now, the theme for me this year is really moving from coaching one team or a couple teams to the team of teams work, where we have a whole group of nested teams. I know you and I are doing some of that work. So I'm excited, to bring some of what we've learned, Ruth, but really also, just continue learning and doing some public learning here and growing the field together, because I think the challenges of the world, the challenges of organizations, nobody has it all figured out. And I think as soon as we think we've got it figured out, the dynamism of the environments are teaching us humbling lessons. So that's really what gets me excited. So truly, what is the science telling us? What's the art telling us? Because a lot of times the field moves along faster than the research can even catch up. So that's what's bringing me to this. So looking forward to seeing what we can create together, and along with the listeners and, from time to time, the guests and such that we're going to be bringing on the show. But Ruth, a little bit more. I know just about you, just looking at your background, I know being in New Hampshire, you've got some binoculars up there, and you're a bird watcher, which is something we discovered that we have in common. I actually do a bit of that as well. But I also know about you that, and sometimes it comes up in your writing, is you reference horses a lot. I know you're into horses. Anything else about you just as a person that you might share before we go a little bit further here in this launch episode and start talking more about what people can expect and about the origins of the 6 conditions framework?
That's funny. Birds and horses. Yes, that inevitably comes up in the context of conversations. And I've already told you that I'm an introvert, which I think is a characteristic you and I share. I love teaching. It has surprised me how much I have really come to love working with teams and seeing people's leadership capacities develop. I'm always particularly excited by working with groups that are trying to solve really important problems, and supporting them in discovering how to be really clear about their purposes and develop together the kinds of norms and work practices that allow them to pull that off. And so I've been trying to keep sort of one foot in the science and scholarly research around teams and one foot in practice and bringing that together in my work all the time. And I actually see that in you too. And so I've appreciated our collaboration to this point really very much. And I feel like bringing those two things together to the practitioners and scholars who care about teams as well is a really,
funny sometimes when we're presenting together or we're working together, we get introduced as you're more the academic and I'm more the practitioner, and we always giggle about that because I think we both share that, maybe not equally, but it's funny. I think so. That is something we both share. Yeah, I think for me, just similarly, I have a passion for learning, mentoring, really building learning experiences for teams and groups of people. And I think something that's on my mind, and maybe it's even showing in the background a little bit, I also care about nature and birds. And I've even been extending some of the work around teams out into nature, onto the ocean and other places. And really, that stakeholder of nature and the environment is something that's oftentimes lost. And we might go to nice retreat centers and hotels and where the nature is kind of in the background, but I'm really interested in really looking at the larger ecosystem within which teams and organizations and communities are really, creating hopefully a sustainable world. So I have very much a purpose-driven motive, in addition to, wanting to make a good living and doing something meaningful in the profession, but it goes a bit beyond just, doing well and doing, there's a doing well and a doing good part of the motivation for me around this. But Ruth, maybe here in this launch episode, we can talk back to the hero of this, which we want to keep grounded around the 6 conditions framework, which is, a really practical but really well-researched approach to thinking about teams and really guides the designing and launching and coaching of teams. So why don't you speak briefly about that? I know we're going to be unpacking this in future episodes, so we don't need to go on a deep dive, but maybe for the listeners who are new to the 6 conditions framework, just a brief entree into that, and then we can talk a little bit about what listeners can be expecting in the upcoming episodes.
Yeah, I think I have to start by talking again about the late, great Richard Hackman and his work on this really pithy and I think eminently practical question, which is he has been on the search for the handful of conditions which, if you put them in place, collectively most increase the chances that a group of people will form a really superb performing unit and will chart their course to great collaboration over time. And he started his research originally at Yale and then ultimately at Harvard, really being focused on teams whose performances mattered in real time. So he was doing research on cockpit crews in aviation, on performing ensembles, especially musical ensembles, really interested in how do you design those things and set them up and get them off to a good start in a way that they really evolve into something brilliant. And his team effectiveness model that came out of that work was published in this wonderful book, Leading Teams, Setting the Stage for Great Performances. And he originally conveyed what was at the time a 5 conditions framework, a real team with a clear purpose, some sound structure, working in a supportive organizational context, and getting some real hands-on coaching. All of those things are designable. They're all things that you can put in place. One of the things that I think was so wonderful about this work is that rather than being focused on the team dynamics, particularly dysfunctional dynamics, and relational things as the point of intervention, he recognized those as emergent processes that come from somewhere. And he was asking the question, well, what are those inputs? What are those antecedents that lead to processes for better or for worse? And And so he named the original 5 conditions framework and published it in his book. When he and I began collaborating on the leadership team's research, we began to see how critical the composition of the group was, and how important having the diversity of perspectives and the different skills and capacities in a leadership team, how much that aspect of the design of a team mattered. And so ultimately we pulled that out and made the right people, the team composition, its own condition in its own right. And so out of that leadership team's work, and of course the 30 and 40 years of teams research that Richard had done before then, and the many studies that I had done and many of his students and colleagues, we framed this 6 conditions framework, which is, in our view, the handful of conditions that if you think them through and you design them right in the first place, you can stack the deck in favor of a team becoming a really great team over time. And so we have tested and validated and explored this framework in a whole variety of different teams and different settings at this point. And I think it's important to underscore that over the course of the work that we have done, many of these studies involve doing various questionnaire and survey measures of these 6 conditions. And over time, what Richard and I did with our colleague Erin Lehman is we created the best version we possibly could of survey measures of these 6 conditions that drive team effectiveness, and we collected them into what we ultimately came to call the Team Diagnostic Survey. And so we created this great instrument that any task performing team can take. So all of their members would fill out the questionnaire, and it feeds back to them really great diagnostic information about how well designed each of these 6 conditions are for their own team. And so we formed an organization called Team Diagnostics. I think it's a little more than 10 years ago now. And we've been making the Team Diagnostic Survey available to any researcher who wants to study teams, any educator who wants to teach about teams in their classroom. And he and I, like you, Krister, have really shared this deep passion for developing others' learning. And it has always been our mission to spread this framework to as many people in, as early in their lives as possible, so that people really develop this dexterity at forming and launching and leading brilliant collaborations. So it's long been my aspiration, as well as his, to really spread this, particularly in education. And I'll say, at this point, in the absence of Richard after his death, 4 years ago now, that I really do feel a powerful sort of legacy and responsibility to keep this framework alive and to continue the work that he and I started. I'm sorry, it was actually 6 years ago. So we want to bring this framework, the 6 conditions framework, and the ability of people to build great collaborations to the next generation and to the next generation and to the next generation.
Yeah. So what I love about that, when I went back to the book and started to work with this framework, is it's really I think, just to start with, a way of thinking about teams that's grounded in evidence, it's grounded in research. And, I think something you really spoke about is a lot of times we get called to intervene in teams because there are emergent dynamics around the team that is creating some pain, and that calls us in. And then we might come in and get tempted to treat the symptoms. But where I like where you went is that underlying those emergent dynamics are structural conditions that oftentimes, if you kind of follow the smoke a little bit to where the fire is underneath it, that those things are really just symptoms of deeper misalignments or lack of those conditions being in place. And when you get those conditions in place, you oftentimes will alleviate a lot of the interpersonal problems that oftentimes come up. But then also, I think if you do have strong conditions in place, when emergent processes do surface, they're much more addressable. And I think that's something that goes back to my work around conflict resolution. Is I was intervening a lot, especially in international organizations, around lots of toxic interpersonal and team conflict. And what we would find is just trying to teach people conflict resolution skills or doing mediation was really just letting some steam off. And it wasn't enough. Even if you trained everybody in a whole division or department, it wasn't enough to stop the quantity of conflicts emerging. And until we got down to those underlying structural conditions, we just, we weren't really seeing any progress. And so that's one of the things that got me excited about this work, is I think it's really practical. the framework is a really great way of thinking about teams. Again, like designing teams, setting up an ecosystem and an environment from which great teamwork will emerge, and then really getting into how do you get teams off to a great start, and then what is the ongoing coaching around the emergent dynamics that are coming up that really can help keep a team on task and keep it focused. So that's really what we're going to be exploring in this podcast, and really opening that up. And so maybe this is a good time, Ruth, to talk a little bit about what listeners can expect in these episodes that are coming up. Does that sound like a good idea?
Definitely. Yeah. Thanks,
Okay.
Krister. And thanks for that great illustration, by the way. I think your example about the conflict resolution work you were doing is just such a great picture of why we want to do this podcast, which is how much more can those of us who are passionate about collaboration and who want to support teams and leaders and who want to develop great teams, how much more powerful and effective we can all be if we bring together both the science and the art. So just as an overview of what our participants and listeners can expect from the podcast, in the early episodes, we're going to be focusing on the 6 conditions framework and just understanding what are the 6 conditions, why do they matter to team effectiveness, where would you actually start your thinking about fostering great teams, and why are these 6 conditions the most important ones. And we'll look at illustrations in each case of teams that are in good standing on each of the 6 conditions and how that actually helps their ultimate effectiveness. And we'll also look at ones that are not in such great shape and why that's actually getting in the way of their ability to develop as a great team. We will share illustrations of how to actually work with teams and to improve the design of the 6 conditions. We will share the ongoing original scholarly science that is exploring influences on the effectiveness of teams. We'll share lots and lots of case examples of different kinds of real teams in real organizations. And we'll also be exploring many of the modern trends of how teams and collaborations are changing over time, particularly in this very fast-paced world of high levels of interdependence and high levels of uncertainty. So we'll explore the modern science and the modern practice of teams as well.
Yeah. And just building on that and adding, I think, from time to time, we'll probably bring some guests on who are doing some great, examples of working with teams or even other thinkers from other, disciplines about this, so we can just broaden the conversation as well. I know Ruth and I both work with a lot of leadership teams in a variety of types of industries, but we're also going to be looking at teams that are primarily charged with innovating or accelerating learning, and obviously teams that are actually needing to execute and implement. So we're going to be exploring the application of this to a broad range of team types. And hope to have a lot of fun with you along the way and to really have a great conversation and spark a lot of learning, both between us and with the listeners of the show and the guests that we bring on from time to time. So Ruth, coming up in our next episode, we are going to be really starting with a key question, which we'll invite all of you to think about, which is, where would you start your thinking about fostering great teams and why? So in each of these episodes, we're going to kick it off with an inquiry question, something to think about. So think about that question before you tune into the next episode number 2. Where would you start your thinking about fostering great teams and why? And that's where we're going to be picking it up in the next episode. And so, great. So thank you so much, Ruth. Excited to be on this journey and get this podcast up and running. I'll leave it for you to say the final word, and then we'll say goodbye, and we'll see everybody next time.
Yeah, thank you, Krister. And I hope listeners out there, we've whetted your appetite enough that you'll join us again for our next episode. Do a little reflecting on the question that Krister posed about where you'd start your thinking about fostering great teams. And we'll see you on episode 2, where we'll explore the 6 conditions framework.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. For show notes, links to great resources mentioned in the podcast, and for more information, go to 6teamconditions.com. See you next time on the 6 Conditions Podcast.